Suddenly, in September 1993, the world's media were proclaiming a new era of peace in the Middle East. In a historic and controversial move, Israel recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, which had committed numerous terrorist atrocities, as the official representative of the Palestinian Arabs. A declaration of principles for the negotiations for a peace accord was agreed upon.
What we are doing today is more than signing an agreement. It is a revolution. Yesterday, a dream. Today, a commitment. The Israeli and the Palestinian peoples.
Some 3 decades after the initial signing of what became known as the Oslo Accords and its historic handshake between sworn enemies, the dream remains a dream, the commitment never realized. Indeed, there is not even agreement on what was contained in that signed commitment back in 1993. Excluded from the original Declaration of Principles at that time, by mutual agreement between both parties, was any discussion about a Palestinian state or the status of East Jerusalem.
The autonomy is in Gaza and Jericho, not in Jerusalem. Jerusalem after the Jericho and Gaza.
Yet before the ink had dried on the agreement, the PLO was already claiming that Jerusalem, and particularly the Old City, with its holy places and shrines, would be the capital of a future state of Palestine.
Jerusalem for the capital of Palestine.
The Oslo agreements don't say anything about the status of Jerusalem. They say this is a matter which is going to be negotiated. So I don't believe that the Oslo agreements in any way waive or contravene or undermine or change the status of Jerusalem prior to 1993. Interestingly, the Oslo agreement does not talk about Palestinian statehood. It doesn't say that a Palestinian state will be created. It simply says that Israel agrees to enter into a process to resolve the conflict.
There's never been any legal commitment, legal document, treaty, agreement, contract, or formal binding resolution that's determined that the territories belong to the Palestinians, or that they're under Palestinian sovereignty, or that they're Palestinian.
A number of issues were explicitly reserved for final status agreement, and those included the status of Jerusalem, it included the status of the settlements, and these were all matters that Israel and the PLO agreed to negotiate. But it never says that all of the West Bank will ultimately belong to the Palestinians. That was a matter for negotiation.
Today, some 3 decades on from the original signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993, its provisions have been conveniently forgotten by the Palestinian Arabs. In 1995, Israel and the PLO signed a further interim agreement that became known as Oslo II, which gave the Palestinian Arabs autonomous government in parts of Judea and Samaria, which include Bethlehem behind me.
In the Oslo Accords, the Israelis and Palestinians agreed that to divide the areas pending a final status, a permanent status agreement, to divide the areas into 3, areas A and B, which are the main Palestinian towns and villages, which will be transferred by Israel to the Palestinian Authority, which was set up in order to administer these areas, and area C, which is an area that's sparsely populated, but it contains Israel's military installations and settlements, and this would remain under the jurisdiction and control of Israel. The Palestinians agreed to this. In legal terms, it's called lex specialis. In other words, it's a special legal regime that overcomes all other legal regimes. So it's prior to the Geneva Convention or anything else, because it's agreed upon between the Israelis and the Palestinians that areas A and B, they will rule those areas, and they will legislate, and they have their court and their parliament and whatever. And in Area C, Israel will continue to administer this area from all points of view until there's a permanent status. And it says specifically in the Oslo Accords that each side has the freedom to do planning, zoning and construction in the areas under its control, which basically means that the Palestinians can build what they want in their areas, and Israel can build whatever it wants in its areas. And there's no limitation in the Oslo Accords on settlement activity or building or anything like that.
So yes, I grew up in Israel in what is called the Israeli left, the Labor Party. I grew up very much believing that the conflict was about Palestinian statehood, drawing borders, settlements, and very much believed that the day that the Palestinians would have a chance to have a state of their own in the West Bank and Gaza is the day we would have peace.
The Oslo Accords were very divisive within Israel, both within society itself and politically. Most people on the so-called right wing of the political divide were ideologically opposed to the idea of land for peace, believing that ceding any of Israel's historic heartland to the PLO would be like allowing a Trojan horse into their midst. That has certainly proved to be the case. However, the majority of people on the left, like Dr. Einat Wilf, believed, as she does to this day, that the way ahead is to show good faith to the people known as the Palestinians in order to bring peace. This is exactly what Israel embarked on with the Oslo Accords.
In my view personally, even though Israel has a claim and legitimate claim to the land, it should, as an act of goodwill, make it clear that it's renouncing its claim for most of it in order to demonstrate the notion that peace will be achieved when both sides recognize that they cannot have it all.
In the year 2000, US President Bill Clinton met with Yasser Arafat and the then Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak at Camp David in Maryland. The aim? To bring about a negotiated final status agreement under Oslo. Dr. Einat Wilf was an advisor to the then Foreign Minister Shimon Peres at the time of the Oslo negotiations in the early 1990s.
The 90s in that respect were a time of euphoria for me. I felt that we were finally putting that idea, we're implementing it, and that peace was just around the corner. I remember the handshakes on the manicured lawns, the soaring speeches. There was really a sense that this was all finally happening. And then in 2000, in many ways, it all came crashing down. And the years since then have been ones of devastation. Not just for me, for the Israeli left in general.
In 2000 at Camp David, they're talking peace. And everyone thought at that moment, peace is around the corner. In fact, Arafat was already planning the Second Intifada. As soon as he got back home, he walked out. Simply walked out. He'd gone there as a man of peace. He actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for doing it. He won a Peace Prize for going home and starting a war.
In 2000, Yasser Arafat rejected the best deal that he could have possibly got. One has to ask the question, why? Could it be that he would have to abandon the Palestinian national charter that calls for the destruction of the Jewish state? Was it that he wanted to disinherit the Jewish people of their historic and cultural capital, which was recognized as such in international law, without having to make any concessions whatsoever? Was his ultimate aim to rip the heart and soul out of the Jewish people through the international community, compelling them to surrender their ancient capital, which is so central to their cultural, religious, and spiritual identity?
They know that Jerusalem is a weak link in the chain because they know that Jerusalem is actually the center of the Jewish people, and without Jerusalem, there will be no Israel, because without Zion, there is no Zionism. And they know it very well. Unfortunately, too many countries in the world still do not recognize Jerusalem to be part of Israel because they still stick to the partition plan of 1947, which mentions that Jerusalem should be under international government.
The Palestinians tell the world in English that Israel exists and they recognize its existence, but they will never recognize Israel's right to exist.
From the beginning, and I think until this very day, the main goal of the PLO on the international arena is to undermine the status of Israel as a state among the states in the world, to undermine the recognition which states gave to Israel as a state with the right to exist.
Amongst themselves, they say that they don't recognize Israel on any borders. For external consumption in English, they will claim that they recognize Israel, but they will insist that they won't recognize Israel as a Jewish state.
Everything which they can do in order to weaken Israel and to bring it to its knees. Everything is okay. And this is actually the derivatives of the charter of the PLO.
Moreover, the PLO undertook in the Oslo Accords to renounce terrorism and to amend their founding charter that calls for the liquidation of the State of Israel through armed struggle. Not only does the aim of the destruction of Israel remain the central platform of their charter, but as Israel conceded land for peace through negotiation, Palestinian terrorism actually increased in response.
To have people being blown up, families, children, in cafes, in buses, and it's in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, in Beersheba, not in the West Bank, not in Gaza. Supposedly nothing controversial about these areas, but this is where families were being targeted and were being killed.
In the next episode of Whose Land, we examine the 2004 opinion of the International Court of Justice in response to the construction of Israel's security barrier to prevent the large-scale murder of its citizens by Palestinian terrorists.